Hi there, coming to you from the home office here in Clintonville to talk about the introduction, the first four chapters of A People's History of Christianity, Modern Christianity to 1900, edited by Amanda Porterfield. And we'll start with our introduction, which is really pretty weak, unfortunately. It does give a definition of modernization as the preference for rational explanations of life that privilege individualism, nationalism, scientific enterprise, and strategic planning. That's page 1. That's one way to define it, but it's not widely shared, I guess. Yes, individualism and nationalism are certainly features of the modern world, as is science, but I think more the ideology of progress and the understanding of progress associated with each of those developments bears scrutiny, and she doesn't mention the term. She does talk about Christian connections to imperial power as a key during this particular time period up to 1900, and sets the leading examples of that connection: Spain, Portugal, the British, French, Dutch, and Germans. Yes, that's absolutely right. She puts it well. Christianity often demonstrated the language of democracy, but it was also a language of social control. And that tension between Christian liberation and Christian social control plays throughout these chapters in some really interesting ways. She then touches on 3 different topics: cosmology, individualism, social criticism, and reform. Highlighting, interestingly, the way the Bible and literacy coincided with capitalist expansion, and this is Max Weber's central insight back in, 1910, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And she traces more broadly, under individualism, the emergence of hypocrisy and this sense of contradiction between the ideals of Christianity and the actual practice. In other words, people were not unaware of that. She cites Roger Williams, who published The Bloody Tenet of Persecution and really advanced soul liberty, which eventually became religious liberty, addressing precisely that hypocrisy between following the Prince of Peace and then slaughtering and massacring other people. Nicely traces how individualism led to the transformation, as she puts it, of Christian life from an enveloping world to an available choice. That's on page 12, and that's a pretty good description of what modernity and the secular age has done. Increasing pluralism that goes along with the kind of travel that people were doing in the modern world eroded any easy assumption of religious authority, whether it relates to individual roles, priests, pastors, and so forth, or institutions, and even discourses and practices carry less weight as we discover the relative differences across traditions. Final section, social criticism and reform, points out how missionaries were often at the vanguard of pointing out the worst of the political and economic exploitation that was taking place during this time period. Women were also in the vanguard of women's rights, missionary women in particular, and we'll be studying some of them coming up pretty soon in Barbara McAfee's book. And yet the irony is that the social changes many of these Christian reformers instituted passed quickly out of their control. That's on page 18. And I think that's a good insight as well, is that modernity brought with it some of these ironic outcomes. What we imagined would be, this continual progress and technology and industrialization and so forth, we are now wreaking the havoc that these initiatives and developments have produced as well. And all of that's reflected in our religious experience. But I said this was a disappointing introduction because it doesn't really take us into the lived experience of people. What do they see, hear, taste, smell? What do they do even? There's little of that here. Unfortunately, where do they go? Even more, who are they? And this is the promise and the benefit of people's history, is that it does take us beyond the institutions and the great men and ideas school into, what difference does it make that there were Christians, that there are Christians around the globe in various times and periods, and who were they? What did they do? What did they feel, and so forth. So the chapters are better because they are more focused and they get us into some particular topics. So first, Carlos Ayer, New Ways of Confronting Death. Basic argument is that by 1900, the Christian religion had lost its hegemony, that's a quote, over how to deal with death. And the consequences of this for parish pastors and religious leaders are pretty significant, given that Christianity, since Constantine, pretty much became in many ways a cult of death, with death as the central problem that the faith addressed for individuals. And if that's no longer the case, which I believe Ira is right, it's not, then what is the point of Christianity? Not to say that it doesn't relate to death, doesn't have anything to do with death, but there isn't that overarching Christian meaning associated with living and dying as would have been the case prior to modernization and secularization. So, death in Christian tradition is the first section. Here, purgatory, masses for the dead, indulgences, last rites, all of this emerges during the Middle Ages and generates the entire system of Roman Catholic devotion that I think Iyer does a nice job of tracing, that actually strengthens in reaction to modernity and modernization, and strengthens because of the Protestant attacks precisely on this cult of the dead, associated with funeral rites, lavish funerals, and the veneration of saints, who of course are all dead, and shrines and relics and so forth. All of this coming out of the Middle Ages is what Protestants attack. And that attack then, as Ayer puts it, Luther did away with purgatory and severed the connection between the living and the dead. So the notion was this entire system of indulgences and the masses for the dead and so forth gave people something to do in relationship to the dead, and established a relationship between the living and the dead that the Protestant critique of popish idolatry and superstition did away with and raised into question. Raising it into question then led to a backlash and a resistance to these secularizing changes that were associated with Protestantism as well. There were some common concerns, and I think Ayer is good to point them out, namely the martyrs, such as the Quakers, and those who died in the 30 Years' War on both sides. And this common concern for our dead led to an alternative way to resolve disputes that Ayer is not particularly fond of, and many historians are not, but it's called confessionalization, which Ayer associates with social disciplining and state building. Those things are true, but confessions, such as the Augsburg Confession, Westminster Confession, others that emerged in the modern period, are also documents designed to resort to words rather than to war. And I think it's very important to make that point. Confessionalization wasn't only about social disciplining and social control. It was that, but it was also about building consensus, growing consensus through a deliberative process as well. The ars moriendi, the art of dying, grew during this time period, early modernity, as did, interestingly, notions of hell and fixations on hell. As Ayer puts it nicely on page 45, scaring the hell out of people, literally, was a strategy of the early modern state. And how did that turn out, after all? Skepticism arises. Mutual recriminations across Christian groups lead to increasing doubt. No question about that. And as modernity proceeds into the 19th century in particular, the doctrine of hell declines in many circles as a contradiction to the idea of a loving God, and the notion of prosperity, continuing, ongoing progress associated with one's posterity as well, begins to emerge, replacing death, replacing heaven, interestingly, as the legacy or that which is to be sought. And there's a wonderful book from, I think, the 1940s by Carl Becker called The Heavenly City of the Enlightenment Philosophers. And the basic point is progress replaced heaven in modernity. So the secularization of death, undoubtedly true. Cemeteries and graveyards move from church fronts out into the suburbs. Funerals become businesses, industries, rather than something that families do. And so generally new ways of confronting death heightened the individual and eroded, in many cases, the sort of communal aspects of death and dying that had been part and parcel of the Christian world for centuries. All right, Peter Gardella, Controlling and Christianizing Sex. Gardella wrote a book called Innocent Ecstasy, which was about Christian attitudes towards sex. The book came out maybe 20 years ago or so. And this book draws on that research as well. Nicely sets up the contrast from the 1893 World's Fair between Fatima, this exotic dancer in effect, exotic in the sense that supposedly, belly dancing from the Middle East, with Frances Willard, the president at the time of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who is exhorting people to life of hygiene. And of course, the WCTU was behind prohibition, which of course was a disaster as policy. So what Gardella is doing in this chapter, that contrast, points to a tension in American culture between sexual purity on the one hand, Frances Willard, and sensuality. And it's that conjunction, Gardella believes, that highlights or helps explain the modern Christian experience regarding sexuality. Tracks three trends. First is that increasing rules and mechanisms are developed to control sex. Second, accommodations are provided for the pleasure of secular patriarchs. And third, reforming Christians lean on evangelical perfectionism, feminism, medical theology, and psychology to promote this particular conjunction of sexual purity on the one hand and sensuality and sexual fulfillment on the other. So the chapters are in 5 sections: controlling sex, indulging in sex, making sex medical, purifying sex, and exploring sex. The first 3 are pretty straightforward. He documents how Christian preoccupation with sex arises in the modern period to rival the kinds of debates Christians once had about the power of the Pope, nature and grace, free will, and predestination, the use of images in worship, and so forth. Those were the things Christians debated about for centuries, but in the modern era, sex became the issue. And that in itself is an intriguing question, and I've actually published a little essay entitled "Why Now?" That raised the question: why is it that so many churches have been torn over debates regarding sexuality? What is it about this particular time in our history that has led us to this point? Gardella helpfully traces, all of the efforts underway to control sex, both Roman Catholic and Protestants in different ways. sex outside of marriage was always a mortal sin and became more so in the modern world as the church increasingly controlled marriages, including, of course, the threat of excommunication for divorce. And Protestants focused often on anti-prostitution efforts with layers and layers of misogyny involved. And Gardella traces nicely how under Protestant regimes, women lost legal power and status during the early modern period. Second section, indulging in sex. The church has lost control of sex, Gardella simply puts it, and I think that's right. And if you want to understand where the fixation on sexuality came from, that little sentence right there might explain it. The church has lost control of sex. And Gardella, I think, nicely and helpfully points out how the slave system generated this loss of control by the churches of sex, because slavers could rape with impunity. While that was happening, at the same time, you have individuals such as the Marquis de Sade and others who are advocating for a libertinism in association with sexuality that flew in the face of what the church had been trying to control. What emerges as an alternative is what Gardella calls sexual sentimentalism. That is the kind of Victorian romanticizing of sex and gender. Yet sex still is understood as sin, and increasingly sin is sex. Now, this goes back to Augustine in many ways, but I think the stakes ramped up in the modern world. Fascinating little section about how Pentecostal spirit possession parallels sexual ecstasy, and you see an increasing turn. This is right, I believe. Gardella traces nicely how an increased focus on pleasure in married sex in particular becomes understood as God's will. Alongside that development within the churches, making sex medical, you have medical evangelists preaching a scientific sex, which then gives rise to the entire hygiene movement, purity crusaders, as Gardella pens them. But along with this sort of control mechanism, again, the central dynamic, is this emergence of a consensus on mutuality and pleasure as the ideal for sexual relations. So purifying sex and exploring sex, the last two chapters are kind of strange. I mean, he's trying to point out this innocent ecstasy, this emphasis on controlling sexuality, maintaining boundaries around it, and at the same time indulging in it. That tension is the one that he's tracking throughout, and points out that the early medical institutions were less permissive than Roman Catholic moral teachings regarding sexuality, including such ideas as the anal and oral sex treated as perversions within the medical establishment. So it wasn't only Christians who were seeking to control sex and explore its wonders, but also the medical establishment. And basic point is the church has lost control of sex and have tried ever since to sort of maintain control. Next chapter, Corrigan, Economic Change and Emotional Life. This is really one of his signal contributions, is to try to say, hey, people felt things. And what were they feeling when they were being religious? And along with that, he links it to economic life, because his argument is that religious emotion and capitalism are intertwined. That is an experience in the way moral systems get generated, the way authority gets vested, and communities emerge. These two things, economic life and emotional life, are linked. So he wants to put those together, develops brief sketches of three emotional climates appearing in American religiosity during this time period. Not just American. Self-deception, number one. Self-assurance, number two. And self-control, number three. With really the last one, this idea of self-control emerging as capitalism proceeds. The reign of the commodity, as he puts it, leads to a culture of negotiation where everything is in flux and up for negotiation. So self-deception first. Capitalism erodes equitable or stable relations, Gardella argues. Certainly the class system that had been in place in Europe gets undermined as capitalism develops. And what emerges then is this climate of self-deception, or this concern for self-deception. Inequalities, Gardella argues, lead to this notion of these feelings of fear and guilt, the self discovered in its fraud. Puritan diaries, the witchcraft craze, Spanish visions, the emergence of visions of Jesus and Mary, and then colonial Africa and the Afrikaners in South Africa in particular, all manifest this ubiquity of guilt and fear, and these systems then develop around to deal with this concern about self-deception. Could quibble with some of those examples, but he's on to something that is certainly evident as a climate, an emotional climate in association with capitalism. As we perceive inequalities, rivalry can get stoked, and then one can wonder about one's own authenticity, is how it often gets manifest today. Self-assurance, on the other hand, comes out of situations where there are relatively equitable relations. And here, hope, wonder, acceptance, and trust are the manifest emotions. God, rather than being the sovereign judge of under the climate of self-deception, God is a neighbor, and communal solidarity then is the result. And the examples that he highlights here are pietist Germany, the notion of Gemeinde is, sort of soulful togetherness. French Catholicism, reciprocal love between God and man. And you see this in the cuisine, just for one example. And in Russia, interestingly, in the literature of Dostoevsky and others, this notion of theosis, that God became a human so that humans can again become divine, that sort of happy exchange. And then the Quakers, as a fourth example of this sort of self-assurance. The Quakers were, of course, pacifists on the one hand, but also entrepreneurial on the other. Robust participants in the capitalist systems. Final section then is emotional control, which combines aspects of self-deception and self-assurance. And it is this that Corrigan sees as sort of the emerging out of the modern world, and equanimity in the face of unpredictable change. So mobility reveals even more inequality, and that stokes fear. And yet nationalism, interestingly, provides stability and actually allows for the kind of focus on the self, on the individual, that was not the case in the Middle Ages, say. And so the examples that he develops are the businessman's revival of 1858 and the devotion around the Sacred Heart of Jesus in France. And this notion of the businessman's revival are these, specific prayers focused on outcomes of one kind or another, and this very much, continues down to today in some of the prosperity gospels and megachurches and so forth. Whereas the Sacred Heart of Jesus, continues to be a devotional focus within Roman Catholicism. both centered around this idea of finding ways for religious discourses and practices to provide comfort, consolation, and or at least equanimity in the midst of rapid and unpredictable, uncontrollable change, which may very well be the characteristic feature of modernity, not just progress, but this constant flux of change associated with different commodities for sure, but also with the processes of production, the kinds of labor that we are engaged in. And that was, of course, Marx's great insight. Religion then becomes the opiate of the people. And I recall my father, of sainted memory, saying, yeah, of course, religion's a crutch. What? God. Yes, of course, that's its point. Anyway, so that's Corrigan's chapter. And the final chapter then, Ron Numbers on vulgar science, trying to figure out what everyday, ordinary people were thinking and feeling and doing about the emergence of modern science. And a basic point of the chapter is not much, because they weren't reading Newton by and large. But, some interesting insights emerge nonetheless in, again, 4 sections. This time, the sacred and the natural, the vulgar enlightenment, popular science and religion, and then of monkeys and men. He tracks how astronomy, geology, biology, chemistry emerge to eventually become normative, the standard way of perceiving and thinking about the world, but not really affecting much, everyday life until after 1900 in many ways. So the things that emerge in association with science on the popular level are quite fascinating. And so the section there, he talks about astrology, alchemy, phrenology, and mesmerism, and so all of these ways to sort of develop pseudosciences as along with the sort of high-level intellectual and pure science developments that are taking place. People are transforming it in all kinds of ways in interesting systems. Same is true of Christian thinkers, not just opposing science. It wasn't really until Darwin that opposition really set in, but trying to find ways to coincide Christianity with scientific developments as well. That's probably enough on that chapter. Interesting stuff on, phrenology and mesmerism. As I said, there's huge business of, finding the bumps on one's skull as a way to determine one's, spiritual and physical health, which we look at it now and we go, that's nuts. But think about the debates that have happened in the United States in relationship to science. How few Christians in particular were willing to trust scientists to have their best interests in mind. And the suspicion regarding science emerging out of religion has its roots early on, but among most people, it was just they ignored it until it impacted, disease, disaster, and until they were accused of being descended from apes. And that was the last straw for many Christian thinkers. The origin of the species by Darwin and this idea of natural selection. Well, it wasn't so much natural selection itself that was the problem, as it was this idea that we are somehow animals. Imagine that. All right. It's enough for this week. Some interesting topics, rich with implications for parish ministry. I mean, think about how much of ministry touches upon death, sex, economics, emotions, and science. Pretty inescapable that ministry will connect with these matters. So it's good to recognize their emergence and their change over time among Christians from the ground up, a people's history of Christianity. So we're off and running in that text. Happy reading.